Making a resin mold for casting silicone skins. Now this is a somewhat involved video that I'd really like to recommend more for the more experienced artisans out there, but I'm making this at the request of a number of comments I had on several videos asking me to explain the process for how I made the mold for tattoo skins. Now, in typical Bitty Mold Supply form, I didn't want to make a video just for one singular audience, so this particular process will appeal to those making medical simulators, of course the tattoo skin crowd, and also the special effects people that are also wanting to cast silicone skins out of a resin mold. Now, a lot of these processes I'm going to just skim over because a lot of you that have gotten to this point in our video library understand the general idea of some of these steps. So we're not going to show the whole life casting process, but what I did is I took a CopyCat life cast of the side of a model. And obviously we could do this with any section of the human anatomy, but for this particular project, I wanted a piece that could hang on a wall and be appropriate for demonstrating or displaying a tattoo artistry. So this is ultimately for our friends out at Hold Fast Tattoo in Lubbock, Texas. Now the CopyCat life cast, that's a silicone life cast, and it came out bubble free and didn't have any imperfections that I needed to correct with a clay positive. So I went straight to modifying the mold so I could pull a really nice pattern right out of this mold. So what I'm doing here is I'm mixing up some 5130F. That's the new fast formula of 5130 silicone. So this has a working time of about 6 to 8 minutes at room temperature and a demold time of about 1 hour. So it's perfect for this kind of application, and it's very low viscosity. So in instances like this, there's really no need to vacuum degas it. But what I'm doing here is you'll see I put a little piece of a mixing cup down there to plug up the armhole in the side of in that cast, and then I'm going to pour in that 5130F into that, and you'll see it filling up there at the bottom. And what that's going to do is just act as a little plug in that arm section and make it so it's a nice stylized clean cut. And the whole point of that is ultimately I want this to be a nice display piece to hang on a wall and display tattoo artwork. So I don't want this to look like a graphically severed arm or anything like that. So by pouring that little puddle in there where it self-levels, we get that really nice slick end of the arm, and it just makes for a much nicer looking piece. Now, obviously, I could have sculpted that in clay, but I was lazy, so I just poured a puddle of silicone and did it that way. Now for the waist area, I did a similar process. I used some plaster bandage material to dam up the waist of Danny's cast here. So that allows me to be able to pour another little puddle of silicone to get the same kind of effect down there by her waist. Now these are our very fast setting plaster bandages, so it only takes a few minutes for those to set up rock hard to where we can then go and pour our silicone against that. But again, all of this is really just to create a stylized look on this finished cast, and just to save me the work of sculpting it to look that way. So now I'm going to pour an additional puddle of 5130F into that little pocket there. And the reason I'm using the fast silicone for this is obviously it's kind of precarious. We're propping up the life cast mold in weird positions and then trying to get the silicone to self-level in a certain amount of time. And with the slow version of 5130, that could take a long time, and then we'd have a 4-hour full cure. So this just allows this whole process to move a lot faster. Now we're ready to release the life cast with some Zip 301 release agent, which is silicone oil free. That's why it says non-silicone, because you can use this for silicone to silicone applications. It doesn't contain any silicone oil, so you don't have a risk of bonding or inhibiting when you have platinum silicone coming in contact with that. But again, this is a platinum silicone life cast, and we're going to be casting a platinum silicone into this life cast. So real important that we make sure we spray this down really good and use a soft brush to brush it into the detail. You'll notice I'm taking care there to brush it into all the little crevices, little finger areas and things like that. As you'll see here in a minute, we want to make sure that's brushed in really good. And here's the really important part. When you're doing a release application like this, where you're putting on a fair amount of release, make sure you give it time to dry. So once we get that on, we're going to let that sit for about 30 minutes to outgas, and that prevents us from getting little gas bubbles in the surface of our silicone. Now, once we've released that really well and set that aside to dry, we're ready to move on to the casting stage. Now, some of you might want to watch this video a couple of times because some of these steps aren't going to make a whole lot of sense until you see the whole thing all the way through. Now we are ready to cast our platinum silicone pattern. And again, all of this will make sense later on in the video, but here is some 5110F platinum silicone. This is the fast version of 5110. So this has about an 8-minute working time and a 1-hour demold. And I'm going to take my index finger and check some of the detailed areas and just make sure I don't have any air entrapment in some of those little grooves and things. So checking that out, making sure I don't have any bubbles trapped there. And then I'm going to take some more of the Zip 301 mold release and spray that across the back. And that will break those surface bubbles. The release oil in that will break that surface tension and give that the back of the pattern a really nice smooth finish. Now, one of the reasons I'm going with this approach is, again, I wanted really clean edges on all of this, so it is a lot of silicone to pour. It took a little over a gallon here to pour this up, but that gave me a really nice, level, smooth surface on this, and you'll see later that comes into play in making the resin mold the way I made it. So the 5110F, or the fast version of this has a demold time of about 1 hour. And if you're here in the fine state of Texas and it's warm outside, it's probably going to be a little faster than that. So just remember, anytime you're working with platinum silicones, warm temperatures speed it up, cold temperature slows it down, but you never want to try to cast it lower than about 65 degrees. And here is my silicone pattern. And you see it took a little bit of wrestling to get that out. The whole idea is I didn't want to remove the CopyCat from the plaster bandage mold. I wanted to keep that all together. And that mold can actually be reused. We can now cast a nice resin positive into that same mold. Now, what I'm doing here, and this is another response to one of your questions, is some of you were asking about cleaning up, getting really nice, pristine edges on, especially things like medical simulators and anatomical forms like that. And one of the things I'm doing here to get that nice, clean edge, because you get that little meniscus on the edge of the pour, I'm going back with a scalpel and just carefully cutting that away so I don't have the cast up around that edge that touches the board with that really thin edge that kind of flares out. And that's all the cleanup that's needed to get this ready for a mold. So now we're ready to release the silicone and the baseboard. Now in this case, the baseboard that I'm using is a piece of vinyl signboard, which released beautifully. So file that away for later use. Vinyl signboard makes a great baseboard for projects like this. The E236 spray release that I'm using, this is an important detail. This is different than the Zip 301. This does contain silicone oil. And the reason I'm using it here is this is going to prevent polyurethane resin from sticking to my silicone or sticking to that baseboard. And that's the most important part. And the reason I'm spraying the whole piece with a release like this is, again, not so much because the silicone will bond to the resin, but it just helps everything come out a lot cleaner, and mainly that baseboard, because if that were to bond to the resin, then everything is going to bond together and we can't get anything open. We would destroy the mold to get our part out. Now, for the mold, and I'm just going to go over the mixing and thickening part of this stage real quick just so you get an idea, but the rest of this I'm going to have to move along fairly quick to keep this all in one video. But what I'm going to be doing for multiple batches here is I'm mixing up some of our ArtKast White casting resin. And this is just a basic hard white plastic, just an economy resin that mixes 1-to-1 by weight. And then we're going to thicken it with polyfiber. And this is a fiber thickening agent that can be used in place of thickeners like Cabasil or fumed silica. And what that does is, normally ArtKast is a pourable resin, just a typical pourable urethane resin. But by adding polyfiber to it, we convert it to a thixotropic paste. And the important thing here for using this as a resin mold material is we don't want this to slump all over the place. So we're going to mix in a little bit of this, and we want it to be a consistency of kind of like a pancake batter kind of consistency for this first coat, because I want this thick, but I don't want it so thick that I'm trapping air bubbles on the surface of my part. Now, as cake recipes often say, batter may be lumpy. And sometimes you'll have little bits of polyfiber that don't get mixed in really well. And the most important thing to be concerned here is with the time. You want to get everything mixed up and applied quick, because this resin has about a 3-minute working time. So if you have some little lumps in there, that's okay. The main thing is you want your resin mixed up really well, your parts A and B mixed up. So as you'll see in the finished mold, those little bumps in there did not cause any problems at all. The most important thing is I want to get in there with my brush and really scrub that into the detail. And this is one of the advantages of using a silicone pattern. Now, obviously, this is not appropriate for every application out there. This really is going to lend itself more to those of you making tattoo skins and medical simulators and that sort of thing, because by augmenting that lifecast, we're able to pull a nice, clean silicone pattern, and then we can use that over and over to make really nice resin molds like this, and mainly molds that are one-sided. Now, obviously, you could do a two-sided mold with a parting line, but on a flexible pattern like this, probably not a great idea. Now, once that first layer has kicked, it will turn white. And you want to follow that up as soon as possible. As soon as it gets to a place where it's unworkable, it's getting kind of gummy, you're ready to mix up some more resin and thicken it and get that spread out over your pattern. And you'll notice that one of the first things I do is as soon as I get that resin mixed up and thickened, I spread it out, I pour it out along my pattern, and then start brushing it into the detail. And the reason for that is if you're working out of a bucket and you keep reaching into the bucket, that wastes valuable time of that resin is already kicking off. And when it starts to exotherm or generate heat, that heat will act as an additional catalyst. And what will happen is you'll wind up speeding up what's left over in the bucket much faster because of that exotherm kicking off. So by spreading it out, you give yourself the maximum amount of work time. So remember that, file that away, because that's one of those little details that when people work out of a mixing bucket like that and they keep going back to the bucket, that resin that's sitting there in a thick mass, that can cause it to go off really fast, and that will waste a lot of resin if you're not careful. So again, get that spread out as quick as you can. So that's 2 layers, but I'm going to follow it up on this layer. I'm going to build some legs into this mold. And I just cut those on my chop saw, and we're just going to use the resin like spackle here to, this I thickened up even more, so this is almost like a frosting consistency. And we're just going to use that like spackle to smooth out the outside of the mold and embed those legs on the outside of the mold. And that gives us a nice mold that when we flip this whole assembly over, everything will sit nice on our workbench. Now, the overall thickness we're going for with this is about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch. If we go any thicker than that, it starts to become a profound waste of casting resin. So remember, this is a very strong casting resin. It's an economy resin, but it's not a weak resin. So you get a lot of strength in a 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch. 1/2 inch is more than enough. So make sure that you don't use extraneous resin on this. And also, if you build it up thicker than it needs to be, when it starts to exotherm, that could also cause the mold to warp. So be aware of that as well. Keep that to a minimum. And the other really important detail when you're building a mold like this is polyurethane resin sticks best to itself when it's fresh. So you don't want to put on one layer, wait a day, come back and put on another layer. You want to do that as soon as possible to get a really good bond between all of those layers. So you'll notice as soon as it turns white, I'm coming back with a follow-up layer, and that way everything bonds together really nice. And here I'm just going back with some additional resin, touching up those legs, and again, just thicken this up to kind of a frosting-like consistency, and I'm just buttering that onto those leg areas to stick those onto the mold. And the nice thing about thickening with polyfiber is it is an inert fiber, so it doesn't change the chemistry of the material. It's just like using Cabosil or fumed silica. When you add that to the resin, it doesn't change anything about the working properties other than just thickening it and making it a paste. So you can add as much as you can mix in. So you can make this all the way up to like a bread dough consistency, and everything's still going to function like the resin is supposed to. It's just going to be a lot thicker and obviously not pourable. Now this is one final batch that I've mixed up here. Again, at this point in the mold, I'm mixing this up really thick, and I'm using a brush and a stir stick to come back and smooth out any of those rough areas. Now obviously we can sand this after the fact, but the cleaner you can make your mold going into this, the less cleanup work you have to do on the back end once you remove this from your pattern. Now, obviously, this is not going to win any prizes. The exterior of this is purely functional, and those legs are purely functional. But again, the main thing we're looking for is we don't want rough areas that are going to rip your hands open because that resin will be really sharp once it cures with that fiber in it. So again, the smoother you can get the outside of that mold, the better. And there we have our finished mold. And before we demold that, we're going to clean up the outside edge with a saw some. I call it a saw some because these definitely don't saw everything or all things. So we're going to use that to clean up that outside edge and then demold our silicone pattern. And again, the silicone pattern method that I'm using here, a lot of you, more of the effects inclined people watching this video, you're probably going to lean more towards making a monster clay or an alien clay positive that could be molded exactly the same way. But those of you doing tattoo skins and things like that, this gives you a nice permanent pattern that you could go back to repeatedly, unlike a clay pattern that's lost. So just something to think about there. Now, what I'm doing here on the outside of the mold, again, it's not going to win any beauty contests, but we mainly want to make sure the outside of the mold isn't so rough that it cuts my hands when I'm handling that mold. So I'm using a wood rasp here to knock down any of those little sharp edges and just go around the outside and clean that up a little bit. And now ready to cast into our mold. And again, we're going to bring out our Zip 301 mold release. And again, this does not contain any silicone oil, so this is ideal for casting silicone. This is not a release you would use for when you're casting resin into a silicone mold. This is strictly for when you're casting silicone into a mold, or if you're making a two-piece silicone mold where you have silicone to silicone. So again, we're going to apply that and let that dry. And now ready to brush in our silicone. Now, I could have gone a couple of ways on this. I could have used the 5110 fast or the 5130 fast, and we also could have used some of our skin cast silicones on this. But in this case, I mixed up some of the 5130. I wanted something a little firmer to see how that would tattoo, so I mixed this up and mixed just a little bit of the Thixo additive into it to make it a brushable consistency, but still somewhat of a flowing liquid, more of a just kind of a thick paste. And the reason for that was I wanted to make sure it flowed well enough that I could really get it into those fingers and some of those little wrinkle areas and creases and get everything really good. So I did 2 layers. The first layer I brushed in, let that gel, and then the second layer did the same thing, thickened it up a little bit more. And then this is the critical part. The second layer, once that was in and before it dried, so this is still well within that 8-minute working time, I took some cotton balls and unrolled those. So cotton balls are basically just rolls of cotton fiber. So if you're careful, you can unroll those into little strips and then press those into that silicone before it gels. So again, that's one of the nice things about the 5130 and the 5110 fast is even though those are fast formulas, they still have a long enough working time that I had more than enough time to properly brush this into place and then take those cotton balls, unroll them, and then press those into the silicone. Now I'm just going back and cleaning up that edge, and that just gives me a nice squared off edge, and that's also a good chance to check your cross section of your part. Because for a tattoo skin like this, I want at least 1/4 inch so that I don't have to worry about the tattoo gun going through the skin. So once that's all cleaned up, and we let that set up. This is about an hour later. I'm going back in and pulling off all that excess cotton fiber. And what this is doing is by putting those cotton fibers in, when I pull those back out, it leaves little fibers, little strands of copper that are halfway embedded into the silicone. And that way, when we pour some foam, as you'll see here in a minute, the foam has something to bond to, because otherwise foam against silicone, a polyurethane foam poured up against silicone, won't have anything to stick to, because obviously it'd be like pouring it into a silicone mold. So by giving it those fibers, we create a chance for the foam to have a mechanical bond to the cotton, which of course is then bonded to the silicone. So that serves as kind of a mechanical linkage between those two surfaces. And again, those are two dissimilar surfaces that don't normally want to bond. And the reason I'm using this approach is obviously having flexible foam backing this, that makes it a lot safer for somebody to use a tattoo gun on and not accidentally run into a rigid material, and also easier to demold from a rigid mold. Now for this piece, I'm using our Prop Foam 4, which is a flexible foam, but it's a fairly firm flexible foam. It's low density, so you get a good expansion rate, but this has the consistency of like a motorcycle seat or a fairly firm upholstery foam. And I'm just going to use that brush to carefully steer that foam as it's rising. But you'll notice one of the main things I did with the foam is right after I poured it in, I used that brush to scrub that foam into those cotton fibers really well. And that just ensures that the foam gets a good solid bond to those cotton fibers, which of course are bonded to the silicone. Now, foam typically has a demold time, flexible foam has a demold time of about 30 minutes to 45 minutes or so, depending on room temperature. Now, this is about an hour and a half later. I gave it more than enough time to make sure that the foam was completely cured. And then I went ahead and peeled up that edge just to make sure that my silicone was completely cured. It's springtime here in Texas, and that makes for some kind of mixed shop environment. Sometimes it's still kind of cold, and sometimes it gets a little warm and humid. But in this case, this was ready to demold in about an hour and a half. So now I'm ready to work up those edges and demold our finished part. And there you see we have a nice clean release thanks to that Zip 301. And there is our tattoo skin, or medical simulator, or special effects skin, or whatever it is you're casting, but you get the idea. Minimal cleanup work on the edge, just where that foam creeped over the edge a little bit. But we're ready to clean that up now and take that to our friends over at Holdfast Tattoo in beautiful Lubbock, Texas. So this video is to be continued. We'll come back and check in with Chris Vargas and see what kind of awesome things he's done to this side of silicone. And in the meantime, of course, all of the materials used in this video are available on our website. I've linked them in the video description, so be sure to check that out. And I know for some of you, the purists in the effects community are going to wonder why on earth I went that convoluted route of making a silicone pattern. But I think if you, again, now that you've seen the entire process, I hope it makes a little bit more sense, because now we do have that nice permanent silicone pattern. But as usual, all of the supplies are available on our website at brickintheyard.com, so be sure to check that out. And if any of you are interested in seeing the lifecast process, I may post a video of that as well. But I wanted to do that separate just so I don't get the video flagged or anything. But there you have it, the process of making a resin mold for a silicone practice skin or medical simulator. And if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.